Welcome to Module 2 in our discussion on Introduction to Windows Server 2019. We're going to talk about Active Directory in this module. So let's take a look. Active Directory is going to be introduced in this module. It's a large part of Windows Server infrastructure and security. You don't have to have Active Directory installed in your Windows organization. However, if you do, it adds a lot of security features, management capabilities, and things that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk all about authentication and authorization, what the different objects are that make up Active Directory, schemas, replication, and things like that. So that is basically those are our objectives. We've got the introduction to AD domain services, and we've got the identity, authentication, authorization. Some of you may be wondering, what about Azure Active Directory? Well, Azure Active Directory is not like on-premises Active Directory. It is really a way of authenticating you. That's basically when you use your username and your password. That's authentication. It's a way of authenticating you to using Microsoft 365 services like Exchange Online and Teams and SharePoint and things like that. So it's not the same thing. And you can synchronize your on-premises Active Directory to Azure Active Directory if you'd like. Now, Microsoft has come up with another new thing called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. And what that is it's supposed to be a replacement for on-premises Active Directory, but not a lot of companies have gone to it because it's very complicated. It requires a VPN tunnel. It's just not the easiest thing in the world. However, the good thing about it is it works exactly like on-premises Active Directory. So if you do end up going to the company that uses that, by learning Active Directory here, you're learning the same thing. So let's go ahead and get started. Active Directory Domain Services, this is the big part of Microsoft's security engine. And so we call it Active Directory Domain Services, but it is on-premises Active Directory. And it's responsible for security infrastructure. So this is the way that we secure our clients, our computers, our users, things like that. And it does two things. It does what's called authentication, and it does authorization. So authentication is when you log into a computer, as I mentioned before, you put in your username, your password, maybe your multi-factor authentication PIN or something like that, whatever it is that you use to log into the domain on your computer. And then you have what's called authorization. Authorization gives you the ability to access shared files or applications or things like that. And Active Directory will provide both of those things. The way that Microsoft does authentication is it first has to identify you. So we have what's called identity protection. Identity is the way that it finds out you are who you say you are or not. So it represents all the different objects that are in Active Directory, such as the user, and that includes your username and your password and other characteristics that make up your user account. Then it also includes the device, such as your computer, you have the application or the service. It's just a way that's going to make sure, like I said, you are who you say you are. And once that identity process starts, the authentication process is the next step, and that's where it verifies the identity of that object. So Active Directory sees all these different things as objects: users, computers, groups, things like that. It just sees them as objects. It doesn't see them as one being more important than the other. They're all just a collection of objects. There is what's called standalone authentication. So if you don't use Active Directory, then there is a small amount of security built into the Windows server called a workgroup. So let's say you're on a client computer and you want to get access to a file on a Windows server and you're not using Active Directory. What you can do is use what's called standalone authentication. So you try to connect using File Explorer to the server, and when you do, it says, hey, what's your username and password? So if you log into Windows Active Directory, then you don't get prompted every time you want to open up a file. That's because you've been given a token to open up whatever files that you have the authorization to open. But in a standalone situation, it's not like that. It's going to ask you every single time when you go to open up a file on a server or any other resource that's on a server, it's going to ask you for the username and password that's locally kept on the server. So you put in the username and password, and then you'll have access to it. So it has a local security accounts manager database inside the server. I've gone to several clients over the years that have not deployed Active Directory, and every time I've asked them, they said it was because the previous IT person that would help them did not understand Active Directory, so therefore they did not deploy it. And I would typically then say, well, we need to deploy it, and here's why. And authentication and authorization, those are some of the big reasons that will do that. So when we are joining a domain, you can see what we've talked about with authentication. You join that computer to the domain. It prompts you for the username and password for an administrator on the account, and then it uses that authentication to authorize that account to get added into Active Directory. So now, instead of using a local SAM or local security access management database, you're now using a distributed SAM, which is going to be distributed between all the different domain controllers in your organization. Now, you only need one domain controller, but if you want to have redundancy or you have multiple offices, then it's a good idea to have multiple domain controllers. As I mentioned before, authorization is after you've been authenticated, so you can open up that shared resource. Now, Microsoft has added in something new called claims-based authorization. And so what it does is it uses additional information about your account. Let's say your account has a certain zip code in it, with your address and other types of properties. Or maybe it has the job title that you have. Maybe you're a manager. So what you can do is, besides just saying, I want this group of people to be able to access this resource, you can use this type of claims-based authorization using dynamic access control to do things such as make certain files confidential except for the managers. So if you don't have manager in your title, then you would not be able to open up this file, even if you're in the group that allows you to open it. So it gives you additional security using that least privilege that I talked about earlier. Active Directory services contains all different types of objects, as I mentioned before, users, groups, computers, also printers. So when you start working with ADDS, or Active Directory Domain Services, you got to configure who's going to have access to what. Because your job is not just to lock down people to be able to access resources. It's also to allow people to be able to do their job. So they need access to those resources. So you have to decide, using the various different managers in your organization, who gets access to what. And anybody who doesn't have access, you need to block them. And you can use a lot of different tools in order to make that happen. You've got Active Directory users and computers, Administrative Center. There's multiple different Active Directory tools that you can get in Server Manager. Windows PowerShell, which is the most powerful way of managing Windows servers, but it also requires the most amount of experience. And then you could also use, from a command prompt, instead of PowerShell, you could use command prompt, the ds-add command to say to add a new user. So there's still the old traditional command line tools available, but there's also now PowerShell, which gives us much more capabilities than ever before. Group objects alleviate the need to assign rights to the individual user. So what that means is, let's say you had a shared folder that you want to have people have access to. You could add everyone individually into the company to have access to that folder. Or you could add all those users to a group and then add the group to the folder. The advantage to that is, let's say you've got 100 folders. If you had to add every user individually to those 100 folders, that would take a lot of time. But if you added all the users once to the group and then added the group into those different 100 shared folders, that would be much faster. Also, when you have turnover, instead of having to go into 100 different folders to remove who can have access and to add to the new employee, you could just add or remove the users from the group once and you're done. So these group objects come in security and they come in distribution. These security groups are basically for adding access to resources, whereas distribution is for adding access to email distribution lists. So it has everything to do with email distribution. So they're hardly used anymore because you've already got that ability to do that in Exchange anyway. So you don't need to do that through the Active Directory, but you could if you wanted to. So as I just mentioned, you've got security and you've got distribution scopes. Now, besides that, you've got these group scopes. So when you go to create a new scope or create a new group, what you get is, okay, are you a security group or are you a distribution group? Okay, that's one half. The other half is local, domain local, global, or universal. Local and domain local are very similar. Local is basically just the local Active Directory domain. Domain local is going to also allow additional groups to be added into the security group. So you can put a group inside a group. Then you've got global, which means that you may have an organization that has a single forest, but it might also have multiple different domains within that forest. And that could be because they have multiple different companies, and they need to separate them out by creating separate domains. And then you have universal. Universal allows you to take groups from one domain and put them into groups from another. So it's very similar to domain local, except the difference between domain local and universal is domain local would only be groups from within the same domain, whereas universal can use groups from other domains. And we'll be talking a lot more about this as the course goes on. Computer objects are used to identify and manage Windows-based domain clients using Active Directory. So they have accounts with a sign-in name and password, authenticate with the domain, and they can belong to groups and have access to resources, and they can be configured using group policy. Group policy is a big part of Active Directory, and these are objects that you can use to create management for lots of different things. So for instance, you can say, hey, a username has to have at least 15 characters in their password, or a user cannot see control panel or the system settings. So it's a way of locking certain things down or adding additional features and capabilities. It just depends on which object it is you're editing. After you join a computer and user to a domain, then you're going to get a lot of different capabilities, such as being able to configure things like computer properties. You can move computers between organizational units. So basically, if today a user is in HR and tomorrow they get moved to accounting, they're going to have different rights. And so you can move that user just by dragging and dropping them from one organizational unit into another, and they automatically inherit the correct rights they need to do their job. You can manage the computer, rename, reset, disable, give access to the computer or not, and delete those computer objects. By default, when you join a computer to a domain, it's going to be put into the computer container. And you can move that computer to another container if you'd like, and you can apply different group policies to that container. So you can say anybody logging into this computer is going to have certain capabilities, whereas if you move that computer to a different container, then they're going to have other capabilities, such as what I mentioned before. You can change the way the desktop looks, you can add a login script, you can do any one of 10,000 or more different combinations using group policies. We don't talk a lot about the Active Directory forest, but what an Active Directory forest is it's this logical, construct. So it's the overall forest, the overall container of all the different domains. So in most cases, you're going to find that organizations are going to have a single forest and domain. And those are automatically created, which is something you'll do in your first module, where you go in and you create an Active Directory forest and domain. And once you do that, you can create additional domains inside that forest if you'd like. If you want to create a separate forest, then you can do that as well. Now, you can create trusts between these forests in the case of, say, a merger or a buyout of one company over another. So once you have these two forests trust each other, then the domains themselves can then be used back and forth to be able to access each other's resources as needed. So I think if Microsoft had to do it over again, they may not have used this model because they thought probably that they were going to have a lot more domains inside forests and maybe a lot of forests. And that's just not the way they're being used. Most organizations have a single forest using a single domain. And because we don't have multiple forests, we pretty much forget that they're even there. And so we just have we just talk about the Active Directory domain. We rarely even mention the forest, except for it's created when you create your first domain. So the domain is a group of computers that can be accessed and administered within a forest with common group policies. And every domain includes all the different objects that make up the domain: the users, the computers, the printers, and the groups that you create. And all those devices can collaborate with each other based on what you, as the administrator, allow. So if you allow certain users and certain computers to access resources on other computers, then that is what is allowed in a domain. If you disallow it, then they cannot do that. So it's really up to you as to what happens within that domain. Now, if you take the domain, so we've gone from the forest, we've gone to the domain, which is the smaller unit, right? Because you can have a lot of domains in a forest. Now we go one step further down, and it's called the organizational unit. Sometimes we call it an org unit or an OU. We also call it a container. Those are all going to mean the same thing when it comes to Active Directory. And the reason we have OUs is because we need to apply different group policies to different OUs. So once again, using the previous example of HR and accounting. So HR might have access to certain HR files that the people in accounting don't need. However, HR doesn't need access to the financials like the accounting people need. So you can allow, using group policies, access to certain applications, certain files, certain scripts that run in one OU that's not being run in the other OU. Now, besides the containers you create as the administrator, there's also some built-in containers you don't want to mess with, and that's because Active Directory can't do its thing if you make changes to it. So you've got the domain, the built-in containers, the computer containers, all those different ones. So anything that comes with Active Directory by default, which you'll see when you install Active Directory or when you did that in Module 1, then you just leave them there. You can move things in and out of them, but don't delete them, make changes to them, rename them, or anything like that, or you could end up breaking Active Directory. Prior to Windows 2000, there was the Windows NT days. The NT stands for New Technology, which of course is no longer new. But it had a very flat design. So you could not make things hierarchical. But now with Active Directory, which is basically just a copy of Novell, if any of you have heard of the Novell company. So Microsoft just basically did a pretty thorough copy of the way Novell worked. Then you have this hierarchy. And what the hierarchy does is you can put containers inside containers. You can have a child domain that trusts the parent domain. So you can have this hierarchy of users and devices and group policies and things like that. That'll make a lot more sense after you see Active Directory when you install your first domain in Forest, as you would have done in Module 1. So before, there was nothing like that. There was no group policies. There's no OUs. There was no hierarchy. And so it made it very difficult to manage. But now there is. Now, what makes up all of Active Directory is what's called the schema. So the schema defines the object classes. So a user object has a different class than a computer object. And the reason it needs to know the difference between that is if you're going to be applying a computer group policy, that has different options than the user group policies. So that's one reason why you need to have different object classes for different objects. So when you add a new user, it gets assigned an object class based on the user attributes. All domains in a forest have a copy of the schema. The schema is sort of like the cell structure of, say, a plant. So if you have a cell structure, then it's holding all the different parts, the chloroform, the liquid and all the different parts. But let's say that cell structure collapses. all the liquid is still there, but now it's no longer usable because it cannot apply itself to the various different parts of the plant. Same thing with Active Directory using the Active Directory schema. If the schema gets removed, you've ripped away, all the different structures, all the different cells that hold it together. Yeah, that stuff's all there, but it's completely unusable. So you've got to, have your schema, and the schema looks very much like a database or a spreadsheet. It's just a bunch of cells organized in a certain way that makes them usable. Active Directory objects are units of storage. So the schema is going to define all the different object types. So what will happen is that the directory manager that validates the data and that kind of thing, it's going to do a query across the schema. So it looks in all the different cells for an appropriate object definition. So it can decide whether it's a computer object or a user object or whatever it is. And then it's going to store that information. And it stores those information in what's called a SID, as you can see here, Security Identifier. And that identifier is basically going to be something that is stored in the global catalog and is accessed every time you or your device logs into Active Directory. By default, the domain administrator has the ability to edit the schema. You could even destroy the schema if you wanted to. So you don't want to have a lot of people member of the schema admins group. So junior administrators should be removed from this group. And you do the editing of Active Directory in ADSI, which is an application that's in the Tools menu in Server Manager. Now, I've done a lot of different things in the ADSI tool where I've gone in and I've fixed a lot of problems, but it's also possible to delete something or change something that makes Active Directory very much unusable if you change the wrong thing. So if you use the ADSI tool, just make sure that you know what you're doing. Now, let's say you have multiple different domain controllers. Now, in the Windows NT days in the 1990s, you had what was called a primary domain controller, and then you had a secondary domain controller. If the primary failed, you had to do a promotion of the secondary to be the new primary. Now, starting in Windows 2000, they came out with what's called a multi-master replication model. And that means that all domain controllers are now equal. So any domain controller can be what you'd consider in the old days the primary domain controller. Which is great, because if any domain controller fails, then that means that you can go ahead and have any other domain controller continue to authenticate and authorize users. There are some default partitions that come with Active Directory data store, such as the domain partition, schema, configuration, and application directory partition. These are things that you do not need to change, you do not need to edit, you do not even need to know exactly where they are. They are just parts of Active Directory, and it's important to know that they're there, but you don't really need to do anything unless something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, then you will need to edit these things using tools such as ADSI Edit or using PowerShell or command line commands. Once you do have multiple domain controllers, you're going to want to replicate that data. Now, by default, it'll automatically set all this up and start working. Unless something goes wrong. Once again, if replication stops happening, then one of the domain controllers is going to be what's called tombstoned. So it's going to no longer be able to provide any kind of authentication or authorization to any of the users. And it will do that roughly, I believe, around 6 weeks after communication is lost. So you definitely don't want that to happen. Now, I have had this happen to clients in the past, and simply what I would do is take the tombstone domain controller, I would demote it back to being a regular server, I would fix the communication problems, whatever they were, and then I would promote it once again, and then it would be able to be back in the domain controller fold where replication would once again happen. When a user logs into a computer, the computer will authenticate with Active Directory domain services. So it's going to look for a domain controller based on DNS. So without DNS, Active Directory doesn't work. All DNS does is it resolves names to IP addresses. So if DC01 is 192.168.0.1, the DNS server does that translation. So all you have to remember is DC01. You don't have to remember the IP address. And we'll be doing some DNS configuration in this course. And DNS will continue not just in this course, but also in the 288 course as well, where we get into advanced networking. A domain controller basically holds all the information for Active Directory. So it stores a copy of the domain services directory database in this DIT file and a copy of the sysvol folder. All domain controllers except read-only domain controllers store a copy. So what this means is that if you have a remote office, and remote office you don't have an on-site administrator, you don't necessarily want anybody to make any changes to Active Directory at that remote office in case they get access to it in whatever way, nefarious way that they get. So what you can do is you can say that I'm going to set up this read-only domain controller that will authenticate your users and your computers, but you won't be able to make any changes to it. So read-only domain controllers are really great for that purpose. You don't use them very often. They're typically used in smaller offices. Now, you have to have a protocol to be able to do authentication. And so Microsoft uses a couple of different protocols. It originally invented this one protocol called NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, but it became outdated when it got hacked. So Microsoft started using what's called Kerberos authentication. Kerberos is an open source authentication protocol that it basically keeps getting updated as various different hacks come up. So we're currently on Kerberos version 5 that is used for authenticating you. So why do we need a protocol? Well, protocol is a language, right? So if you go to another country that speaks a different language, you'll need to know that language, also known as a protocol. If you don't know the protocol of that country that you're going to visit, you cannot communicate with them unless you have some sort of interpreter. And that's what Kerberos does. Kerberos is a protocol that speaks Active Directory authentication, as well as NTLM. Now, you're still going to find organizations that will support NTLM because they have older devices that don't use Kerberos, or it's a good failback type of authentication in case Kerberos doesn't work right. Global catalogs are basically going to keep a read-only searchable copy of all the objects in the forest. You need to have at least one domain controller that has a copy of the global catalog. If not, then you've basically lost all your users, you've lost all your passwords and things like that. I recommend that every domain controller has the global catalog, which by default they're automatically. You'd have to uncheck the box to say you don't want it to be one. There was a time when space or storage was expensive and you did not want to have every computer be global catalog, but catalogs only take up a few hundred megabytes at most, so there's really no reason not to have a catalog on every domain controller. Active Directory has what's called master roles, and these master roles add additional functionality to one or more domain controllers, and they're split up into these different roles. So for instance, you've got the schema master, you've got the domain naming master, infrastructure master, RID master, and primary domain controller. So the reason that Microsoft came up with this is when they upgraded from NT4 in the 90s to Windows 2000, they unfortunately were not able to replicate some of the different features without creating these 5 master roles. And they can only be assigned to a single server. Now you can split those servers up. You can have one server have one role and other servers have other roles, or you can have them all on the first domain controller and just leave them there, which is the default. If that first domain controller ever fails, you can seize those roles on any other domain controller. So it's required to have at least one server with these master roles in order for Active Directory to work properly. At the forest level, you have the schema master and the domain naming master. Obviously, in order to create a domain, you have to be able to create that one using some form of structure, and the domain naming master is the one that does it. The schema master, as I mentioned earlier, keeps the structure of everything going. Now, at the domain level, you've got the RID master, relative ID, you've got the infrastructure, and the PDC emulator. So I mentioned before about the primary domain controller back in the NT4 and NT3 days. So they emulate that in the Windows Active Directory of today. So if you don't have at least one PDC emulator, then some things are not going to work right. And when you do end up having a domain controller that has those roles be retired or fail, you have a couple of different ways to move those roles to another server. You've got the transfer of roles. So basically, that's the graceful transfer of these roles from one domain controller to the other. But if you have an unexpected failure of the server that has these roles, then you can seize them. So you can use a utility such as ntdsutil, which you run from a command prompt, and then you can seize those 5 roles to a new domain controller. And then that new domain controller takes on those attributes and then informs all the other domain controllers, if there are any, that this server is now the master's role holder. When you first install Windows Server 2019 on any server, and this includes any other Windows server all the way from Windows 2000, then it's just a server. It can be a member of a domain, it can be a standalone, whatever it is you want. But if you want to make that server a domain controller, then you have to install the Active Directory Domain Services role from Server Manager in the Add Roles and Features wizard. So you add that in, and then once you add those services, then you can go ahead and promote it to be a domain controller. If you want to get involved in Azure more, then you can do what's called Microsoft Azure Infrastructure as a Service. So basically, this creates a virtual server in Azure that takes the place of your infrastructure. So if you have a server on site, that's called your infrastructure. This makes Microsoft be the infrastructure holder. So you can install a virtual machine in Azure, and it can be a domain controller if you'd like, which is going to be separate from Azure Active Directory. And if you create a VPN tunnel between your location and the Azure location, which you can certainly do, then you can have a virtual machine in Azure be another domain controller. I've talked previously about group policy. So we're going to go in a little bit more detail about what that is. So group policy, as you can see, is a framework in Windows operating systems, and it's basically resides within Active Directory Domain Services on domain controllers. And so basically it can control your clients and your users. It can also control other servers and domain controllers as well. And as I mentioned before, Active Directory is hierarchical. So therefore, group policies are as well. So if you have a group policy in a parent organizational unit, and then you have a child OU underneath that, then you have what's called inheritance. So you're going to inherit various different group policies. And it's possible you might end up getting conflicts. So if you end up saying in one policy you need to have a 15-character password, and then you have in another policy say you're only going to have a 10-character password, then you've got a conflict. And Active Directory has its own way of dealing with those types of conflicts, which we'll talk about coming up. By default, Active Directory is going to have 2 group policies: the default domain policy, which affects every single user and computer, and the default domain controller policy, which just affects domain controllers. Now, you can create your own additional policies as well. I usually recommend not editing the domain policy that's there by default in most cases. I like to make my own separate group policies and apply them to various different organizational units, or put them at the root level with the domain policy. And I name them things such as, what if I wanted to name a custom desktop? So I'd create a group policy, I call it custom desktop, and then I would apply it to the OU that I want to apply it in. And so any computers inside that OU would then get applied that custom desktop group policy. So if I ever want to change it, I don't have to hunt for it. I know exactly where it is. I know where my changes are. That's great. If you do all your changes in the default domain policy, then sometimes it can be difficult to find which changes have been made. Now, there is a tool that will help you find them inside group policy itself, but it's just a lot easier to create your own separate policies for each one. Group policies have a storage area. They're stored in 2 locations. You've got the group policy container, that's where all the files are, and then you've got group policy templates. So Microsoft Windows Server Active Directory comes with some templates that you can use. You can also download additional ones, and you can keep those templates in a specific area that you can use. And templates basically save some time. So if you want to apply a security template to make things more secure, then you can apply the security template from that group policy template. And the policies apply to 2 different objects. So as I mentioned before, the objects include users as well as computers, groups, and printers. Well, group policies will only apply to users and computers. So you can have a computer-related group policy change or a user-related group policy change. Sometimes those overlap, sometimes they're different. So a user policy change will be affected to no matter what device the user logs into. A computer policy will be affected no matter who logs into that device. So you just have to decide which way you're going to go. So we talked a lot about various different things such as Active Directory objects, OUs, group policy, and more. By going through your lab and your quiz, I think that you'll get a really good sense of what Active Directory is all about from a high level, and we'll get deeper into Active Directory as our course goes forward.